Good morning. Welcome to the 8th meeting of the committee in 2014. Can I ask everyone to ensure that they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please? That includes people who are in the public seating area. Agenda item 1 is to decide whether to take items 6 and 7 in private. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is subordinate legislation. We have consideration of 2 negative instruments, the first being the Non-Domestic Rating Unoccupied Property Scotland Amendment Regulations 2014, SSI 2014/31, and the Council Tax Discount Scotland Amendment Order 2014, SSI 2014/37. Members have a paper from the Clerk setting out the purpose of the instruments, and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered these instruments and did not have any comments to make on it. Do members have any comments to make on these instruments? Are we agreed not to make any recommendations to the Parliament on both these instruments? Agreed. Thank you very much. And we move on to agenda item 3, which is our main item of business today. It's oral evidence sessions on the draft Community Empowerment Scotland Bill and consultation. I'd like to welcome our first panel this morning. Stuart Hashigan, Senior Community Development Advisor, Scottish Community Development Centre and Community Health Exchange. Ian Cook, Director of Development Trust Association Scotland. Martin Syme, Chief Executive, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, and Andy Milne, Chief Executive, Scotland's Urban Regeneration Forum. Gentlemen, would you like to make any brief opening statements? Mr. Cook.
Good morning. I suppose from our perspective, we would generally welcome the aims and ambitions of the bill and support the general direction of travel. Certainly recognise the commitment of the Minister, who seems to be genuinely trying to transfer power to local communities. So I suppose the key task is whether the bill lives up to that ambition, really. We have a number of concerns and certainly think the bill needs clarified and strengthened in parts. I think there's a number of omissions from the bill that would be good to see kind of touched on at some point. And I suppose
of what you think those omissions are, because last week in evidence some folk were saying that it's maybe too complex. Some people had some concerns round about common good asset registers, for example. So what do you think has been omitted from the bill?
Well, I would certainly agree that asset registers are a must. I mean, if you're going to have an asset transfer process, the idea that communities just guess which assets are there and who owns them and what sort of status they have seems to me a very a big weakness in the planned process. But I also think the complete omission of reference really to community councils seems to be within a community empowerment bill a bit of an omission as well, really. Within our own submissions, there's a number of specific things, but I appreciate that some of them might be picked up more within the secondary legislation and the statutory guidance. It's more about the detail, really. But that seems to me to be a fairly big omission, community councils.
I'll play devil's advocate here, because we often hear at this committee that many community councils are not representative because they're self-selecting. In many places there have not been elections to community councils for some years, and much of the evidence that we've taken in various parts of the country, some folks see community forums, housing groups and other bodies as being more representative than community councils. Do you have anything to say on that?
I would certainly share some of these concerns. I mean, it's not my job to come along here to defend the community councils. It's an observation that we've got community councils, we're discussing community empowerment, and to not include them as part of the discussion seems to be a bit of an omission. I think not doing anything with community councils is not really an option. We've either got to do something with them and strengthen them, or take a bolder decision and say, actually, they aren't, because of the concerns you've raised, they aren't fulfilling any purpose, and we've got to re-look at what we have in place of community councils.
But community councils have already got a legislative place, if you like, so is it really necessary to add to that by putting further legislation about community councils in this particular bill?
I think it comes down to either doing something or doing nothing, really. I'm personally kind of quite attracted to some of the provisions within the Localism Act down south. And if you look at, for instance, the neighbourhood planning provision, which, if you gave that to community councils, would begin to give them a much more proactive and kind of holistic role around planning, rather than just a role which is largely around responding to individual applications. I think there's more creative ways to try and look at strengthening the role of community councils, make them more interesting so they attract a broader set of people, they're more representative, that we do have more elections, etc. So I just think that not having had a review and not really mentioning the community council situation is a bit of an omission. But as I say, I'm not here to defend community councils, it's just an observation with the kind of scope of the bill.
I think it's interesting. They already have a legislative place, which many other bodies don't, and obviously, well, take account of what you've had to say. Mr Milne, you seemed very interested while Mr Cook was speaking there. What's your opinion in that aspect?
I'm always interested when Ian speaks. He's always got interesting things to say. I think community councils cannot be ignored. You're right, they're part of the landscape, and as you quite rightly say, Convener, they have a statutory basis. The question is, do they have the resources to do the job that we're expecting of them? And I think this is often what we do, is we set up structures and then we don't supply the resources to see the job done. If community councils had a higher level of support, so that they were more robust, so that the democratic process was more robust within community councils, then it might be feasible to allocate higher levels of responsibility to community councils. You would then have a statutory underpinning of a system of community representation that currently doesn't exist. And I think that system of adequately supported, accountable, independent community representation is the major omission in the present structure that we have. Could I just go on to make a couple of brief points? Or
I think if we just wait for the questioning, okay, and then you know, okay, you can maybe add something later. We've got a very short period of time and a lot to go through here. John Wilson.
Convener, just on, good morning, just on the issue of community councils, the difficulty I have, and just a brief comment from the panel members, is that community councils are usually, boundaries are usually drawn by the local authorities, not by the communities themselves. Therefore, in many cases, people don't feel an affinity with the community council because they don't recognise the boundaries fit their community. And that's one of the difficulties, I think, if we rely on community councils in many urban areas, determining what should be done in relation to community asset transfer.
Mr Syme, you were indicating.
Thank you. I think this conversation about community councils illustrates what I think is the big fault line in the bill, which is this a discussion about community engagement with public bodies, and should it be therefore the community engagement with public bodies bill, or should this be a discussion about community empowerment, in which case we'd be talking about a whole lot of other things. The community councils issue came up with the Christie Commission, and I think it was recognised that community councils seem to work quite effectively in some parts of the country in the limited remit that they've got, and absolutely do not work in other parts of the country. So it's the idea that, you know, one size might fit all, or one framework might fit all in terms of community representation. But there are all kinds of other aspects of how communities represent themselves to public authorities, some of which seem to have been inserted into this bill in a way which I think deflects from its original intention. But then the bill always was a bit of a kind of exciting title in search of content. I mean, it really isn't about community empowerment.
Can I just say, and I said this last week as well, we don't have a bill at the moment, we have a draft bill, and I think we need to take cognizance of that, and obviously your input may help to improve the bill when it actually is published. Does others want to follow on from Mr Wilson's line of questioning round about the fact that boundaries and other things are imposed by others rather than communities themselves choosing?
I think Mr Wilson's point is absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. I was simply trying to say that community councils are one of the tools in the box, to use that cliché that we should be making better use of. But clearly, most spectacularly, I would say, in disadvantaged areas, in disadvantaged urban areas, community councils do not play the kind of role that they play in the leafier suburbs. The community councils, as a generalisation, tend to be models of resisting change and preserving the status quo, and what's required in disadvantaged areas is radical change and regeneration.
Anyone else wish to add to that part?
I would just support that.
Okay.
I was spoke that as well.
Thank you. John?
Can I go into my main questions, Convener?
Yeah.
And I should have made a declaration at the start and say that I participated in DTAS training because of my membership of a community organisation. I think it was 4 weeks ago on a Friday, spent a whole day with 2 DTAS staff going through the competence training for a committee about to take over a community asset. The issue for me in terms of community ownership of assets, and I think that's the main headline from this bill, is about community controlling and delivering services within their own communities. The issue for me, however, then comes down to how do communities take ownership of these facilities and how do they deliver them? In the present situation, we have a number of models where the community asset transfer can take place. We can have a partial transfer or we could have a full transfer. What would be the preference of the panel members in relation to community asset transfer and how those community asset transfers should be controlled?
We'll have Mr Hashigan first.
Okay. The first thing I'd want to say is I think to the extent that the draft bill is about empowerment at all, it's actually about the things that communities that are already empowered may be able to do. I think to take over community assets or public assets, to exercise the right to request participation in the process, are only things that can be done by communities and community organisations that are already quite well resourced, quite clear about where they want to go and what they want to do. And I think a lot of the communities, whether they have community councils or not, in the more disadvantaged parts of Scotland, are just simply not in a position where it's an option for them or something they want to do. Coming back to the particular point about community assets, we've spent last year working in Ayrshire with 25 communities, producing community action plans. Many of them say a lot of the assets in their communities are deteriorated and they wish them to be improved. None of them say the way we want to do that is by taking over these assets and doing it themselves. So I think we need to be clear.
Can I stop you there, Mr Hashigan? Because our own experience, because the committee recently visited South Ayrshire, is somewhat different, where one community in particular seemed to definitely want to take over an asset, and that did not seem to me to be untypical.
Yeah, I think you're referring to Maybole.
That was one of them, yeah.
I think is one of the few communities where there is an advanced structure and interest. We were focusing on the communities that hadn't had a great deal of attention or involvement in the past, and so they were fairly weak in terms of their infrastructure. That's why the project was established. So my point is, I think not every community wants to take over buildings, land and assets. Some do, some don't, and I think it's not more radical or progressive to take one position or the other. People basically want services and supports that are relevant to them and to their needs. Sometimes that's by taking over assets that don't meet those needs. In other cases, it's by negotiating with whoever manages those assets to make them more relevant. So it's not necessarily the solution to the community's problems, and I think it's only a solution where the community's already got the capacity and the support and the authority and the accountability to be able to take that step.
Do you not think we should be building up that capacity to ensure that other communities who may want to follow the likes of Maybole and others can do so?
Absolutely. I think that's a point we made in our submission, was that capacity building, community development is essential to bring to equalise, if you like, the power relationships of communities across Scotland and indeed to increase communities' level of power and influence in relation to local authorities and others. So yes, I think there's absolutely a need for capacity building support for communities that wish to take over assets, and indeed any other community who may wish to improve local conditions.
Mr Cooke.
I suppose I would take issue with that. I mean, we've got 200 members in communities throughout Scotland, and a good number are in disadvantaged communities. And if you think about it, a good number of Scottish disadvantaged communities own their housing, which is probably the biggest asset that communities can own. So, I mean, I think there's a danger that we almost patronise disadvantaged communities, really. I mean, I wouldn't deny there's issues within disadvantaged communities. I think there's probably a higher level of grant dependency, probably a higher reliance on public sector delivery, etc. So there's challenges there. But you know, I don't really accept...
Can I stop you there as well? Because again, evidence that we have taken as we've gone around the country show that with a small amount of support, communities can go out and find money not from the public sector, but from the private sector. Yeah. A good example of that in our travels of late has been the Seat and Bacchus project. So I'm keen not to talk generalisations here. I'm keen to look at all aspects of what communities are doing. And I think we can sometimes be guilty of making sweeping statements about various communities. And as somebody who comes from a socially excluded community and has lived there for a very long time, I get somewhat frustrated when we make those sweeping generalisations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really the point I was trying to make, obviously not particularly well. I think in terms of the question, I mean, it seems to me that if we're looking at assets, public sector assets, for instance, then, again, it's difficult to generalise. There are different sorts of assets. Some are liabilities, some are assets, some require a lot of work, some are heritage assets, etc. So we've got to kind of look at each asset almost on its merits. I think that's why we need some kind of coherent framework to allow communities and public sector to engage around this agenda. And what we're trying to achieve here collectively, I think, is sustainable asset transfer. It's in everybody's interest, the communities and the public sector, that if assets are transferred, they don't come bouncing back in a couple of years' time. And for me, that's about making sure that communities are engaging in this process critically, so they're making a clear decision about what their potential is, particularly have the capacity and the business plan to be able to deliver on the asset, etc., and building in the capacity building if it's required, and the kind of post-acquisition support that's quite crucial in making sure that the asset transfers work. But certainly we see lots of examples throughout the country of groups doing this very, very effectively, and I think that's what we're trying to build on and widen out and make available to more communities.
Mr. Milne?
Okay, I'm going to take the risk of disagreeing with you, Convener, on this, because I know that you've been out around the country. I know you've seen lots of examples. I think the main problem with this bill, as it's framed at the moment, is it doesn't set itself in the current context of poverty and inequality generally. It doesn't set itself in the context of welfare reform, doesn't set itself in the context of hugely rising levels of inequality, dropping wages. Communities and individuals are just trying to hold their families, their neighbourhoods together. They're just trying to pay the rent. They're just trying to feed their families. We see the proliferation of food banks across this country in a way which is frankly scandalous. The idea that communities want to take over the park in those situations will occur in some cases, and that should be supported. The point that you make, which is most important, is how do we build the capacity, how do we provide the resource for communities to, first of all, be stabilised enough to consider their options, to make sensible decisions, and then to perhaps get involved in taking over assets. This bill moves at one end, this draft bill, moves from one end, enhancing community engagement in community planning, which frankly should just have been done about 10 years ago more effectively, then shifts gear tremendously, 0 to 60, right up to owning swimming pools, parks, power generation centres. And in the middle is where the real business is. In the middle is where most of the disadvantaged communities are. And that's about greater levels of involvement, that's about greater levels of participation, it's about management, it's about community development over time to build confidence and resources to get communities into a position where they can sensibly negotiate with the local authority about which assets might be available, and then to develop a business plan, a viable business plan in the middle of the worst recession that any of us have lived through, and to make that sustainable over time so that that asset remains available not just to those members of the community, but the community more widely. I think at the heart of this bill is a great gap, which is about the issue of poverty and inequality, and it will only be filled if we manage to link this bill with the discussion which is taking place elsewhere in this Parliament at the moment about large-scale procurement. You've heard me make this point before.
I don't want to go along that line, because we have heard you before in that subject, Mr Milne, and I want to deal with this bill rather than the procurement bill here today. Mr Syme.
Firstly, let me say how much I agree with Andy about the context being important. And if you think about that context and then think about the provisions that are in the draft bill, you realise that we're really dealing with, yes, it's perfectly reasonable that there should be facilities and processes for communities to take over public assets should the circumstances be right and should all the other things be right, but actually as a quite marginal additional power in the context of the issues that those communities confront. I think I have a problem with, what is it that the bill is trying to achieve that can't be achieved without legislation. And I think if you apply to a number of the issues that are raised and dealt with in the draft bill, then the same question arises. Is this a bill that is designed to simply raise the profile of issues and make marginal improvements at one end of the spectrum? Or is this a bill which is actually fundamentally about addressing the need to support and empower and enable communities to take more control and responsibility for their own circumstances? And I come to the conclusion it's the former.
Mr Milne said in his statement earlier, and I paraphrase, that a lot of this should have just been gotten on with some 10 years ago, but it hasn't. So sometimes we have to legislate in these regards. Would you agree with that?
A lot of the issues that are is confronted the right word? I'm not entirely sure that confronted is the right word in the bill. Are issues which could have been dealt with with legislation and have arisen in terms of public policy options for ministers since the Parliament was created. There have definitely been opportunities to, and I noticed the recent reflections on the People and Communities Fund. There's another example of a potential resource that could have been deployed for useful purposes being diverted for other purposes. These issues come up all the time. They are issues of practice in how ministers discharge their responsibilities.
Okay, John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Just the issue in terms of why we now have a draft bill before us is, I think, because of the failure of many local authorities and public agencies not to engage in community asset transfer. But that's a debate for another day. The issue that I wanted to raise now is that, are we raising expectations of communities? Because they've referred, and Mr Cook made reference to deteriorating buildings or facilities being closed by local authorities and others that communities have decided they want to try and take over, improve and run for themselves. Do we have the correct funding mechanisms in place to allow, particularly in Mr Milne's case, in the argument, to allow those communities, particularly deprived communities, to actually deliver meaningful service delivery within their own communities without the funding being put in place?
I'll take Mr Cook first and then Mr Syme. Mr Cook.
I think some of the funding's in place, but we certainly need more of it, I think. I mean, the funding takes various forms and there's different resources required at different points in the process, and I think some of it's there. Some of it could be delivered more effectively by refining other support programmes that are available, particularly sort of via the Scottish Government. I think a key part of the resource argument is also about the question of asset transfer at less than market value. And there's a huge issue around the valuation of public sector assets and what communities are being asked to pay. And for me, and for the Development Trust movement, I suppose, what we're looking at here is a different form of public ownership. It's a modern version of public ownership. And therefore, the idea that communities are being asked to pay market prices, which were quite clear not market prices, or book market prices that help local authorities in the public sector, but don't particularly help community organisations. And we're not seeing this as a kind of creative form of investment. So I think there's more work to be done around the resourcing of this process. There's bits of it in place and bits of it are quite strong. It's also variable throughout the country. It depends which part of the country. There's a bit of a kind of postcode lottery here as well at the moment, particularly in relation to Scottish enterprise versus high and the sort of support you'll get within these two areas. So I think further work to be done, but certainly for me there's a big issue about valuation of assets and how we address that with an asset transfer.
Mr Syme.
Well, we seem to be talking about two different things here. I mean, one is the issue about asset transfer, and the other is the issue about communities delivering services. On the latter front, communities delivering services, I think one of the great unexplored areas is the extent to which self-directed support legislation will have an impact on communities and their ability to organise services in a more mutual way than current arrangements. In terms of resources available to support communities to realise their ambitions. Of course, the local authority is only one of a very wide number of agencies, and you're going to hear from the Big Lottery Fund in the next session about their work in this field. There are a number of other agencies involved, and we're very hopeful that the new European programmes might be brought to bear in this area as well. So there are a raft of possible resources available to communities if we can get the support infrastructure and the culture right. And I think it's the culture of enabling communities to realise their own ambitions rather than public agencies having ambitions for communities that we need to do most work on. I think the bill is obviously silent on that matter.
Alec Rowley, please.
My own experience, certainly in terms of local authorities, is not so much that local authorities are reluctant to hand over buildings. Indeed, many local authorities would give them away tomorrow, save the rates, save the running costs, etc. And it's the capacity of communities to take those buildings over. And am I not right in saying that there has been some kind of register produced a few years ago? I certainly saw a register that a lot of the buildings that were in the very worst conditions up and down Scotland were where they were in the ownership of communities. So we could pick up on that, but the bit I'd really like to pick up on is this whole question of capacity building and community planning partnerships, and whether there is the capacity within CLDs or whoever it is to actually deliver the type of support. The question being asked earlier is that should we have been doing this 10 years ago? You've seen yourselves the community education as it was previously becoming CLD, the Cinderella service, the cuts in local authority budgets. And indeed, is there a conflict between CLD being delivered through the local authorities under the massive pressure that's there and their ability to deliver community capacity building in communities when indeed those communities might actually be challenging the council themselves? And is there something that says that if we're serious about taking this forward, that there needs to be some kind of service, perhaps in the third sector or whatever, that's developed across Scotland that can support communities? I wouldn't mind your sort of comments. I know I've touched quite broadly there, but in the role of community planning partnerships, perhaps within that.
A lot of questions in one there. Mr. Hashigan. First, please.
Yeah. Thanks. I agree with just about everything you say there. I think it is an omission that very little is said in the draft bill about community capacity building or the role of community learning and development. And I think, as you say, it is there is a contradiction, I think, between the movement towards more community influence and control over assets and decisions, and the lack of support from local authorities and others to do that. I think at one time when community learning and development was part of Community Scotland, I think we got to a point where there was a reasonably clear integration between the two, the recognition of the need for both. But now things have changed with Community Scotland disbanding, and community learning and development is now back in the education section. And it does some useful work there, but community development is actually much wider and much broader than the remit of the education authorities. So I think something needs to be done to try and ensure that the community learning and development, only a third of which is community development work, which we're talking about, is much more fully engaged with the kinds of capacity building support that's needed in order for communities to develop the means of taking things forward.
I'll take Mr. Syme. I'm interested in the role that the third sector has, Mr. Syme, in capacity building. My own experience is that the third sector does quite a lot in certainly the areas I represent.
I mean, people realise their ambitions locally through the creation of voluntary organisations. That's where we start, and there are a huge number of different ways and different opportunities that people take to do that. And there are 4 new charities formed every working day in Scotland. Not all of them are in areas of multiple deprivation, but many of them are. I was going to say, I mean, my starting point here is I absolutely understand where the question here has come from, but it seems to me there's a kind of fork in the road that is evident to me in all of the discussions that have been had on this subject over the last 15 years or so, and which the bill does not resolve, which is this an agenda about helping communities organise to engage with community planning and with public authorities, or is this an agenda to enable and support communities to realise their own ambitions? And I think the two have got hopelessly conflated. And I think the engagement of CLD services and community capacity building and the direction of those agendas towards enabling communities to influence their local authority is actually at the root of the problem. And I think what we've been seeking in the third sector is a process of engagement and support from statutory agencies to enable communities to develop their own priorities and address their own agendas. And of course, asset transfer is one of a number of ways in which communities might help realise their own ambitions, but it is only one.
Okay, Mr. Mill.
I think Mr Rowley hits several nails right on the head there. I think that the issue of specific resourcing for communities to take their own time to do their own research, to make their own decisions, and then to be able to engage more effectively as partners in regeneration is something which has been wholly missing for many decades now. The rundown of budgets around community development, the shifting of that into an idea that what communities need is education, therefore it's community learning and development is a mistake and leaves the whole issue of genuine independent community development void of the kind of resources that are necessary to do the job. However, I think there are some positive things happening perversely in this very complex world that we all live in. My sense is, through some discussions with COSLA and with people from the Scottish Government, is that many local authorities are now seeing the event horizon of rising demands and reduced resources to a point where the present situation is just not sustainable. And I think they're increasingly looking at the possibilities for engaging with communities and voluntary sector organisations, housing associations, social enterprises, etc., in a much more serious way than they have been before, out of necessity, out of fiscal necessity, rather than a philosophical shift. However, through the practice of successful relationships in better forms of procurement, more progressive forms of procurement through public service partnership models, etc., I think we will see local authorities learning and shifting their culture in a way which will become more symbiotic with their communities and organisations round about them. So I am hopeful on that front. And that does, though, although we don't want to talk about it specifically this morning, that relates to this issue of where the big resources are. There used to be independent resources through urban aid, even through the Manpower Services Commission, through the community programme many decades ago, for communities to use their own assets to do their own work, and there's been some very important examples of what can come out of that. That has been removed. What we have now are very small amounts of money, but we now have a kind of crisis which I think is precipitating some actions through necessity, which I think are beginning to make some of the connections, or at least understand where some of the connections might be, that could take this situation forward in a more collaborative way than we have done over the last 15 or 20 years.
Mr. Cook.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, I think in relation to the question that achieving sustainable asset transfers in everybody's interest. And one of the things we put in our submission is the proposal of introducing a community right to try, because working with local authorities and communities, where there is a question mark about the capacity of the organisation, or you need to test the business plan, you can set up a situation where you give the community a licence for a couple of years to run the asset, and then both parties can review that and see, is this a go or is it not? So it's a useful kind of mechanism where there's a bit of doubt about whether the proposition is viable or not. I think the question of support is a really critical one, and as we go around the country, I mean, I have to say that it is incredibly patchy, both public and voluntary sector support for this level of activity. And that's partly because I think, as a profession, community development's a bit off the pace, if I'm being honest. That 10 years ago, we weren't talking about enterprise, business plans, asset transfer. We're talking about a different set of skills. And these genetic skills are still useful, but I think we have kind of moved on a bit, really, and I'm not quite sure that the profession's kept up to date, and the services have kept up to date with that agenda. When we speak to our members, what they say, the biggest difference, what they're looking for, is direct investment in the organisations. You can do so much through voluntary effort, but at some point you need to have your own staff to begin to do some of the things that Andy was talking about, really. And alongside that, I think, is a notion of having a critical friend, somebody who is prepared to ask them the difficult questions. And Mr Wilson referred to a process we were involved in with Glen Boyd, where we were doing that, really, so that we're not kind of mollycoddling communities. We're encouraging them to make hard business decisions here about whether things are viable. And I think injecting that kind of precision is really important into the process, really. We are currently receiving funding, and there's an instant sort of pilot that the Scottish Government's just launched, or is kind of evolving, called the Strength in Communities Programme, and that's very much about testing that proposition that what is needed if we want to see this kind of community-led regeneration evolve is that kind of direct investment into communities. And in the next session, I know you've got High speaking, and High for some years have pursued a similar sort of policy of directly investing in particular sort of community organisations to try and achieve that kind of development.
Okay, thank you. Cameron Buchanan, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I just wanted to go back to Mr. Cook. In his submission, he said that he didn't really specify the problem with postcodes and other boundary markers to be sufficient. How would you draw the line in community councils? You didn't really specify what it was. The community councils, if you can, the boundaries of the community councils are different from how do you empower community councils if the boundaries are different? That's what I was really going to ask.
That's okay.
I mean, I suppose that I'm operating in the development trust world where communities define their own boundaries and they say that as big or as small as they see that as being relevant to what they're trying to achieve. And I think that works well, and it relates back to Mr Wilson's point about if we're serious about community-led regeneration, at a very basic level, we've got to allow communities the opportunity to define what is their community. And certainly there's a problem when community councils are part of that kind of top-down imposed structure that I think, in my experience working in urban communities, certainly just get the boundaries cut right across natural communities and almost inhibit the kind of activity that you want to encourage, really. So we're looking at two different sorts of processes here, I think, and I'm not quite sure that community councils have a role within community-led regeneration because it does seem to me it has to be built around natural communities. And I think that we've got to give some cognisance and some space for communities to define it for themselves.
Sorry, yes. Community councils are often self-appointed, realistically, and they don't very often work because they appoint themselves. How would you empower them? You talked about empowerment earlier, and how would you empower them? And do you think that's a necessary thing to give them resources? You mentioned resource.
I think it was Mr Milne who talked about resources, but it's certainly an issue, I think. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at community councils as the lowest form of governance, if you like, within the kind of overall framework, then you've got to be looking at the possibility of them taking over some budgets, taking over some resources, some service delivery, etc., or having some greater control over that, rather than just, as they seem to do largely, comment on individual planning applications, really. And I think it's also about trying to encourage community councils to take a proactive role, because I think, as somebody already said, that in my experience, they tend to be populated by older people who don't want change. And what we're trying to do is create change, and therefore renewal is important.
Thank you. Could I come back? Yes, I've been to lots of community council meetings, and the one thing seems to be no to planning, no to this, very negative. Yeah. But that's partly because they're self-appointed. And I wonder if you would comment on that. I don't feel, if you empower them, is that going to change? I give them resources. I don't think it is. But what do you feel? Sorry.
Could I come in on that? Because I think there's a kind of chicken and egg thing here. I think if there's a task to be done and a responsibility allocated, the reason I wouldn't join a community council is there's nothing to do except object to planning processes. If I thought my community council in my area was going to make real meaningful decisions about local planning issues in a proactive way, was going to allocate resources, which I think are important for my area, I'd make damn sure I got involved in it.
What about community councils who have had significant resources given over to them and have had the ability to make spending decisions?
And what about them?
What's happened with them? Is that been a different kettle of fish compared to run-of-the-mill?
I'm not aware of specific examples that I could quote, but I think surely throughout the case, whether it's community councils or any organisation, people will only get involved if there is something substantial to do. And that would be the process by which more people coming involved might create a level of competition, might create a level of selection, and might improve the... I mean, frankly, the same goes to some degree for local authorities. We saw when local authorities were being consistently stripped of power and status, the level of people willing to put themselves up for the very difficult job of being essentially a voluntary council fell away. When you rebalance the level of responsibility for local authorities, rebalance the resources and the decision-making process available, the situation becomes competitive again. And I think that model is not just about community councils, I think it's about all kinds of organisations.
Mr Hashigan.
Quite a few things I'll try and fit into this, but I know this committee is to look at local democracy and public engagement in a future exercise, so hopefully some of these
I hope you see all of the interlinking that's going on here in terms of regeneration, procurement, this bill, and a look at the autonomy and flexibility and constitutional place of local government.
Yeah.
It all kind of fits in.
Surely does, yeah. I think in terms of community councils, I think the things I'd like to say is, first of all, it's a very mixed picture. Some are completely moribund, some don't exist, some struggle on, some are very boring, some do some very useful developmental work. So, as do development trusts and other vehicles. So I think we need to accept or recognise that there's a very mixed picture of resources for community empowerment, community development across Scotland, and communities will kind of gravitate towards the ones which they see as most active and most effective in taking forward what they do. And I think the rules are different. I mean, I'm not sure whether the actual boundaries of community councils is a major issue. If it's part of the democratic system, presumably the boundaries would be set by the Boundary Commission, not by the communities themselves. They're set by the councils, right? Okay, set by a higher authority, let's say. So it would be part of the state's definition of where those boundaries would lie, and presumably any changes would be pursued through that means. But I think it's really just to come back to the point that community councils may or may not be the best vehicle or the most appropriate vehicle for taking forward development locally. In other cases, different things wouldn't. Just a final point. I was up north in the Highlands.
Very briefly,
yes. I was up north in the Highlands on the invitation of a community council a couple of weeks ago, and one of the outcomes from that conversation was it would probably be in the community's benefit to either establish a community association or a development trust, because neither of those things happen in order to take forward the things the community wants to do.
Mr Simon, then I'll take... Okay. Mr Simon.
I think where Stuart ends up is the point I was going to make, which is that people vote with their feet. They get involved in the things where they think they can make a difference and which reflect their energy and enthusiasm. And if that's not in community councils, I wouldn't say that was because community councils aren't elected. I would say that's because people have found better ways to express themselves. I mean, you know, it would be helpful to establish an indicator of community involvement and to measure whether successive policies were successful in generating more or less community involvement. For example, I think the emergence of development trust is an indicator of successful community involvement in the things that they want to do and achieve for themselves. There are many ways, by distinction, there are many ways in which individuals and communities can engage with the public sector. And it's not just about community planning, it's not just about the local authority, it's not just about community councils. I mean, for example, the issues about community engagement into health and the organisation of health services seems to me to be entirely absent from this debate. So we're still talking about kind of the different silos of public sector organisation and public authorities here, when we should be talking about bottom-up community engagement and the things that matter to them.
Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Convener. I think, moving on slightly from the community council issue, the point was raised about capacity that exists within communities, and even within my own constituency there is a variance between different communities about involvement. There are some very active community councils, although they would probably still fall into the self-selecting bracket. There are some areas which don't have a community council for what they would define as their specific community, but there are a range of other organisations operating within that area, be it a residents' association, be it a regeneration group. The question would be, in terms of the capacity within those communities, who's best to assist those communities to develop that capacity? Often, in some communities, there can be a trust relationship with the local authority that breaks down. For example, if the local authority takes particular spending decisions that involve the closure or mothballing of local facilities, and then the local authority comes in and says, we'd like to help build up your capacity so you can take over this facility which we shut in your community, there's not necessarily that trust there. So what's the best way to develop capacity within these communities?
He's going to start off in that one.
Mr. Syme.
Well, there isn't a best way. I mean, I think I would start by saying that what's important here is that there are a plurality of ways in which communities can seek support to realise their ambitions, that we must not create this kind of structured pipeline process to deliver particular services from public authorities to communities. I think it's important that communities have access to independent support and resources, and that there's never enough of those, and that we need to keep working on making sure that the priorities of various resources, I mean, the People and Communities Fund could be reconfigured to play that role. The Big Lottery Fund already plays that role and should be encouraged to extend it. The European structural funds, as well as local authorities and other players, could contribute to that agenda. But I think what's important here is not to try and conflate, and I saw this in last week's evidence session. There was an issue about bringing all the different sources together into one process for communities. I think that would be ill-advised, because I think it's the diversity of sources and the diversity of purposes and processes that will serve communities well in this respect.
Yeah, I think that point is well made, and I think it's a complex world, it's a diverse world. I think one of the best things that comes out of this bill is simply the process of discussion of this bill, actually. It's a bit like the referendum. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's full of uncertainties, it's full of disagreements, but I think we've all agreed now that it's a really, really important discussion to have, and we've all agreed that there's a certain imbalance in resources and decision-making processes that needs to be shifted, and that's the case here. What we should resist is that one-size-fits-all, this is the model that needs to be followed, this is the way that communities need to fit in with. I need to come back, though, to the importance of connecting the aspirations of this bill up to the other things that are happening round about us in what is the 7th richest country in the world. There is something wrong with the way in which we connect things up that means we have to have food banks in the 7th richest nation in the world, that we have continuing areas of concentrated disadvantage over nearly half a century now in some areas where we just haven't managed to make the connection. SURF is doing some work through something called the Alliance for Action, specifically to connect up local projects, local initiatives, local knowledge with larger scale resources through councils, through the Big Lottery, through the Heritage Lottery Fund, through others, to try and bring these things together. But the underlying terrain of all of this is a really, really difficult economic situation for the most disadvantaged communities. If we miss that out of this discussion, and if we talk only or largely about asset transfer and the role of community councils, we will be missing the most important challenge that we've got here. Very, very briefly, I was in speaking to a project yesterday called, very briefly, okay, right, called The Portal. It won a SURF award last year. It's an arts project. Across the road, there's a project called Platform for people with mental health issues. Been running for 7 or 8 years. Great project, great symbiosis, you can imagine, between those two. Local authorities decided to take out the 2 social workers who provide that capacity building support for the Portal Mental Health Project and told that project, it's up to you to run your own committee now. A form of empowerment, perhaps? No. The whole project begins to implode and collapse. People with mental health issues go across the road to the portal, wanting help with what are essentially mental health issues. It's not always about asset transfer, it's not always about development trust, it's about underlying good quality basic services and making the best of the connections that should be there.
Mr. Cooke.
I mean, I think, just following on from Andy, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think that it's disappointing that the word renewal has been dropped from the title of the bill, because for me that was the context. It was about how we promote community-led regeneration. And having had that quite significant change within the policy, which we would fully support, the question was, how do we implement that? And I think this bill had the potential to offer some, or has the potential to offer some kind of framework for doing that. In relation to capacity, I mean, I think we've got to be clear about what kind of capacity we're trying to build and for what purpose. And there's a real danger that we make all sorts of assumptions in doing that. I think when we start talking about enterprise, people immediately jump to the assumption that we need business people in the committee. Actually, you don't. It's about how you think about things, really. Some of the most problematic development trusts have got lawyers on the boards who create often all sorts of problems for the group. You think it's a great resource to have, but actually it can be an absolute nightmare.
You're opening up a can of worms here, Mr. Keek. We'll get lots and lots of views about lawyers now, on the one hand, and on the other hand, etc. On you go.
Well, it's just, I think it's just that kind of assumption about who's good for a board and who's bad for a board. But if it's about, for us, it's about how do we build the capacity of community organisations to become the kind of strong community anchors that are going to drive community-led regeneration. And I would just make a plea that what's happened in Scotland to date has been quite exciting over the last 15 years. A lot of it's been quite organic, quite bottom-up. We need to listen to communities who are doing that and find out what sort of support they require at different points in the process and where we may or may not be able to get that within the current structures. And I think, for instance, if you take the Scottish Government has really supported social enterprise over the last number of years, which I would applaud. We could probably nuance that support a bit more to look at how we could deliver some of that resource to better support community-led regeneration.
Yeah. Mr. Hashigan.
Yeah, I think this comes back to engagement. I think, yes, some communities can and do find their own capacity-building supports, but for those that don't, I think it should be a responsibility of the engagement of public bodies with communities to actually find out what capacity support they might need and where they might get it from. It may become part of the reformed community learning development, because I understand that in future community learning and development partnerships are going to be required to produce plans for capacity building in their areas to last 50 years. And with luck, that will investigate the resources that are available, how well they're coordinated, what the gaps are, and try and meet those gaps. So if that works, it may help communities get access to the most appropriate form of resource to support them in the direction they're going. But that leads me on to a point I was hoping to be able to make earlier on about the long-term viability and sustainability of resources in the hands of the community, and it fits in with community planning as well. I'm on the executive committee of a long-standing organisation that's got its own youth centre. It has several staff, but the problem for it is always trying to find funding to keep the staff in post and keep the service going, despite the fact it fits entirely within the priorities of the single outcome agreement and the community planning in the area. Community organisations end up in competition with each other for the limited resources that are available and spend a disproportionate amount of their time trying to chase down relatively small bits of funding to try and keep the skeleton structure going, in the hope that at a future time there may be more funds available.
Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I recognise a lot of the points that are being made, and one of the communities I represent is one of the most deprived communities in Scotland. But have we got the balance wrong in terms of the focus, the statutory focus that exists on community councils, where there are a range of community groups and organisations, many of which are probably more representative than a community council is, but which don't have a statutory recognition, statutory underpinning, statutory footing, and are therefore often missed out when it comes to the wider consultations that take place around what happens within communities?
Mr. Malthurst?
Yes, we have got the balance wrong completely. Just as we've got the balance wrong in where we put regeneration funding investment. The funds which used to go to disadvantaged areas now go into much more business-orientated models. You remember the Spruce model, £50 million. £50 million. Where has that money gone? £9 million worth of it has gone to redo a building in Queen Street in the middle of Glasgow. The other £9 million has gone to build an office and hotel development in Haymarket. Developers were on BBC Scotland pleased to say that they were delighted with this site because it was right next to the fourth busiest rail station in the country. It was next to where the trams were coming through. It was next to the main economic centre of the capital city of this country. That £50 million was obtained by the Scottish Government, £24 million from the Scottish Government, £26 million from the European Investment Bank, to be invested in disadvantaged areas. If Queen Street and Haymarket are the most disadvantaged areas in Scotland, we're in real trouble. So yes, I think we've got our priorities wrong.
Mr. Singh?
Well, yes, I mean, the distinction I would want to make is between statutory bodies, such as community councils, established by statute, which have a remit and an accountability in that context, and community organisations which set their own priorities. And I think the distinction I would make is one should not expect any community organisation to represent the totality of that community's interests and ambitions and views on any subject. I think what's important is that there's a plurality of community organisations and different ways in which people can express their interests and get involved in the things that matter to them. And that what is important in the statutory world is that public authorities learn to deal with diversity and pluralism in a way which they find rather uncomfortable just now. I mean, I'm always struck by people coming to me and saying, well, what does the voluntary sector think about such and such? And actually, the voluntary sector will have lots of different views about any subject under the sun. We're not corporate. We're not part of the public sector. We do come at issues with lots of different communities of place and interest. And I think that's a healthy thing. It's not to be confused with public authority and public agency.
I'm going to stop you there because I think we need to move on, because one of the things which we haven't covered to any huge degree, and I think we must do before we end this session, is on outcomes and how communities themselves get involved in the processes to ensure that the outcomes that we all want to see are delivered. Are we paying enough credence to communities when we are developing plans to create good outcomes? Have we got the bones in this draft bill to improve that situation? Mr. Hashigan.
I think the sections of the draft bill which talk about the right to request participation in a process to deliver outcomes is potentially a step forward. I think it gives some power to communities to set the agenda in a way that maybe has been missing, despite the best efforts of community engagement and community planning. So we'll see. I think, but that right seems to be conditional on quite a complicated process of approval, and may actually be a barrier to that being taking place. But the spirit of the legislation, I think, is that communities might be in a position to define the outcomes that they wish, and I think that is progress, even if the means by achieving that progress are different. One thing I'd like to say, though, is I think there's a lot of unresolved issues around the definition of community bodies. I think partly the draft bill has two different definitions of what is a community body in different sections. And I think both are somewhat unsatisfactory. I think there is a danger with community, particularly with the taking over of community assets, that we may end up in a situation where one section of a community has access to those assets but actually excludes other people in the community. So I think there's a real danger of a lack of equality and a lack of participation. Very briefly, I was sent the Scottish Refugee Council's brief 5 words. Equality, participation, inclusion, accountability and representation should be factors which any body purporting to be a community body should be able to demonstrate. And I'm not sure that everyone that does that has those factors.
Mr. Cook.
I think that the Scottish Government's quite clearly got its strategic objectives, which I think provides a very good overarching framework. So for me, it's how does community-led regeneration deliver? And I think it delivers against a number of these, really. I mean, I think the process of community-led regeneration, quite clearly, what's implicit in the process is that at the outset or near the start of the process there will be consultation, and the community will develop some kind of plan or aspiration or vision of where it's trying to get to, really. So certainly I think it's important that we help and support communities to evaluate how much progress they're making in relation to the objectives which the community have set itself. And I think that's really quite important. I think there's a danger we overcomplicate this and make this too technical for communities, so we should be making this easy. And if the community's ambition is to reverse depopulation, it's not that difficult to assess that, how much progress they're making against that, and what measures are contributing towards that progress. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that for a lot of development trusts and similar sorts of organisations, community anchor organisations, they are receiving funding, as well as generating income themselves. They're receiving funding from up to 5 or 6 different funders, all of whom have or demand different outcomes, different outputs, etc. And it can be an incredibly complicated process. So I think there's a requirement that some of the funders might look to how they bring their accounting processes in line to try and support community-led regeneration.
Mr Mill.
Yes, I agree with Ian. Certainly, I think there's a real danger here of overcomplicating the process. I think it's reasonable to engage with communities to get broad ideas of what kind of outcomes communities would like to see, to create a structure in order to ensure that that is sufficiently representative and accountable in itself would require the kind of investment over time that we've talked about, which has not been made in community development over the years.
Planning for real events where communities have that feed-in?
Absolutely. I think there are lots of different useful models in a piecemeal, patchwork, mosaic way to send ideas to the service providers for what kind of outcomes we should be aiming for. Whether we can achieve that, given the much other stronger currents and forces that are affecting the outputs, which result in different outcomes, is a question. I'd like, if I can briefly...
Very briefly, because
okay.
we've got literally a couple of minutes left here.
Okay, I'm going to channel a community representative who I was speaking to about coming here today, and speaking about community empowerment generally, he said, it's like being invited back into your own house by well-off people who've kept you out on the street for 10 years while they made a complete mess of it. They had all their pals in, had a huge party, they ate all the food, drank all the beer, spent all the money, sold off the best bits of furniture. Only now that the house has been completely wrecked, they've decided to invite you back in. Even then, they're telling you you've got to stay on the ground floor where the biggest mess is. They want you to help clear it up, but they don't want you going upstairs because it's still quite nice up there, and they've still got their pals in planning the next big party.
Very good. Thank the person for that piece of evidence. I think that's very useful and sums some of the stuff up. Mr Syme.
I think it does tell a very powerful story here, and I think your question is back to my central problem, which is you are conflating public sector outcomes and the debate in the public sector about how to set outcomes with community empowerment. Community empowerment may or may not include some consideration of outcomes that have been set by public authorities. So is this a bill about helping communities engage in public sector structures and public sector outcomes, or is this a bill about community empowerment? My advice would be, and I know it's not going to happen, would be to absolutely ditch all of the references to community planning so that we are clear this is a bill about empowering communities. It's not a bill about making community planning work or about community engagement, which is a different subject.
Okay, can I thank you all very much for your evidence today? I suspend for a couple of minutes for a change in witnesses. Thank you.
Hi. Would it be possible to have a copy of
He's got
you were channeling?
We move on to this morning's second panel. I'd like to welcome Eric Samuel, Senior Policy and Learning Manager for the Big Lottery Fund, Mike McCormick, Assistant Chief Constable, Local Policing East, Police Scotland, Rachel McCormick, Director of Strengthening Communities, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and Sandra Holmes, Head of Community Assets, Highlands and Islands Enterprise. Would anyone like to make any opening remarks? Mr. Samuel.
Thanks for inviting us to give evidence this morning on behalf of the Fund on the draft bill. The Big Lottery Fund is the biggest of lottery distributors in Scotland and the UK. We are responsible for distributing 40% of the money raised for good causes by the National Lottery, and we are committed to our mission of bringing real improvements to communities and to the lives of people most in need. So every year we give out millions of pounds to community groups and to projects that improve health, education and the environment. As you will have seen from our evidence we submitted to the latest consultation on the draft bill, our main interest is in the provisions relating to community right to request rights in relation to property, or more simply, community asset transfer. This is because the Big Lottery Fund has been an enthusiastic supporter of the community ownership of land and other assets for 13 years, providing communities all over Scotland with a total of around £76 million to help them acquire and or develop a truly diverse range of local assets that are important and matter to them. This started with the £15 million of lottery money we invested in the original Scottish Land Fund in 2001 to support rural communities only with a population of 10,000 or less to acquire, manage and develop rural land. Having seen and evaluated the transformative impact that the Land Fund had in rural communities, in 2006 we extended this sort of support to urban communities too, and to other forms of assets in the shape of our growing community assets or GCA investment area. To date, GCA has invested a total of £52 million in 148 projects throughout urban and rural Scotland. And since 2012, we've again been working with Highlands and Islands Enterprise, or HI, to deliver for the Scottish Government this time a new Scottish Land Fund, this time funded by the Government, aimed at supporting rural communities to become more resilient and sustainable through the ownership and management of land and land assets. The independent evaluations we have undertaken of the original Scottish Land Fund and the first round of GCA have demonstrated the difference or outcomes the projects we have funded are bringing about on the ground in communities, and have convinced us that community asset ownership is an extremely strong and powerful vehicle for empowering and revitalising local communities. And this, as I say, accounts for our interest in this bill.
Okay, anyone else? Mr. McCormick.
Just really to say that Police Scotland were really interested, motivated in the agenda of empowering communities, and perhaps slightly at odds with one of the previous speakers, do see the opportunities to do some of that through the community planning structure, and would be interested in talking about that dimension and its relationship to Scottish Government focus on outcomes.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ms McCormick.
Highlands and Islands Enterprises has a dual remit for social and economic development over 5 decades, and absolutely central to the role of our organisation is empowered communities driving forward community-led regeneration, and we're delighted to be here this morning to give evidence to be able to support your considerations.
Thank you very much. If I could start with Mr. Samuel, because you have talked about the interest that the Big Lottery has had. We've had some evidence in the past that excuse me, the Big Lottery has been helpful in securing capital monies for various projects, but often the failure has been in trying for communities to secure revenue funding for those projects. Can I ask you how you're going to balance that? Because it's all fair and well providing capital monies, but if communities then have a building or an asset that they cannot afford to run because the revenue funding is not there, that seems to be a bit of a waste of everybody's time and effort, and beyond that, it leads many folk in communities to give up in terms of driving things forward in their own local areas.
I think what we find, if you look at GCA, convener, we actually provide both. So we don't actually provide just capital funding, we provide the revenue funding as well. Now the maximum amount of time we can give that funding for is 5 years. So through GCA, certainly we do supply both. The evaluation of the investment area has proved, in fact, it's vital to do both. So we wouldn't consider in not doing that at all.
5 years is excuse me, a very short time period. How do you ensure that your initial investment in the 5-year revenue funding is actually going to lead to a sustained project after that 5-year period is over and done with?
Well, we provide grant holders with support through a social enterprise who we've engaged called Social Investment Business to actually work with the projects. So we talk about ourselves more as an investor nowadays. We don't just think about ourselves as a grant giver who give a grant and walk away. We actually provide ongoing support through the social enterprise who will help them with business planning, financial planning, that side of things. There's other help we provide through a contract as well with, say, self-evaluation, because we think it's very important, as came up in the previous session, that projects know where they're at. Are they succeeding? Are they failing? Are they meeting outcomes? So we provide them with support through a company to help them to evaluate as well.
I'm going to take Mr Wilson in briefly on this point.
Convener, it's just on that issue in relation to the transfers and the issue for communities. Previously, the big lottery gave grant funding to community organisations if they took the lease of a building, a 25-year lease. Never. There might be a misconception that's out there then, because of the issue arose where the transfer of the building or land. I know the Scottish Land Fund is different, and I know one or two of the submissions have made reference to the inclusion of buildings within the draft bill so that we're clear in the face of the bill, and I did argue this last week. So the big lottery is quite clear. They would only give grant funding, capital grant funding, to community organisations where they were taking on the ownership of the building.
If it's through growing community assets, but if we have another 2 major investment areas called life transitions and supporting 21st century life. Now, should there be some property interest in those investment areas whereby the group is operating out, of a facility, then we may pay the, leasing for that. But I'm talking here about growing community assets, whose aim is to see the transfer of assets to communities.
I think we want to look at the entire gamut, though, of the funds that you have available,
right,
not just in terms of asset transfer per se and that ownership, but also in terms of long-term leasing from other funds where you have had a role to play and have provided some funding in that regards from other sources.
I lead on growing community assets, convener, so I can't talk authoritatively on the other 2 investment areas. I suspect that's what happened. I don't think that we'd be providing long-term funding for 25-year leases under those other investment areas either. And we certainly do not do that through growing community assets.
I think it would be very useful for the committee if your colleagues could write to us to clarify that situation in terms of Mr Wilson's line of questioning. Okay. John?
That's all at the present moment, Convener.
Okay, thank you. In terms of cooperation, you talked about Big Lottery cooperating with Highlands and Islands Enterprise in terms of strengthening communities. Can you give us examples of what has happened there and what the outcomes and how much community involvement there has actually been in some of these projects? Ms McCormick can start, yeah, please.
Specifically, we've been collaborating with BIG since the opening of the Scottish Land Fund in 2012, and there are 3 parties in that: the Scottish Government who are providing the funding and the framework, BIG and ourselves as joint partners delivering the fund. Perhaps Sandra, who actually leads on the Scottish Land Fund for High, could give a couple of examples of the nature of projects and community involvement. Convener?
Yes, Ms Holmes.
Through our partnership with BIG, we identified the strengths of our relative organisations, and we've got a very complementary role in delivering the programme on behalf of the Scottish Government. So, in Highlands and Islands Enterprise, across the whole of rural Scotland, because the Land Fund pertains to rural Scotland, we provide dedicated support to groups on the ground to help them from initial idea through to working up a competent and robust project focused very much on the outcomes that government are keen to see achieved through the funding. Our colleagues in BIG deal with the administration and the assessment of the grant processes. We work very closely, and we've got constant dialogue between all the staff on the ground delivering it. We see ourselves very much as a wider team, and we've, since the Land Fund's been in operation for 2 years, there's been £3 million of investment into projects, and 19 awards have been made involving both capital and also some revenue funding.
give us an example of some of these projects and the community's role in terms of driving these projects forward?
One of the first projects that was supported was the community of Colindrive and Glendurul in Argyll. It's a very big, ambitious project to purchase a public asset. It was a forestry plantation owned or managed by the Forestry Commission with a value of £1.5 million. And through working with the community in Colindrive and Glendurul, which was an established organisation very much looking at the wider regeneration of its locality, £300,000 of capital funding and also £50,000 of revenue funding went into that project. The community are driving that project forward. The balance of funding came from private investment, and what they're seeking to achieve through the project is to create more economic opportunities. There's one full-time equivalent post has been created, and they're also looking at developing woodland crofts.
And in terms of the governance of that, yes. Is it the community that leads?
Oh yes, sorry. The governance is the applicant body is a company limited by guarantee that's got open membership to a defined geography in its locality. The membership of which then elects directors to form the board, so it's 100% community-led and community-controlled.
Often we find situations where folks are a little bit feared in communities, a little bit scared to get themselves involved in that kind of board level. How do we encourage people to take on those responsibilities and ensure that they have the backing to be able to achieve that? What's HIE doing in that regard? Ms.
We
McCormick.
have a range of programmes of support and what we call a basket of products and services. So there are about 60 resources at the disposal of HIE staff in terms of specialist advice and support that we can draw down. So if the community were to come to us and say, well, actually, there's a particular issue that we've got around decision making or a particular issue that we've got around succession planning or governance structures or competency of our directors and the roles and responsibilities of directors, we can, within a matter of a few days, bring to bear specialist advice, which might be internal staff, it might be an external expert, depending on the nature of the advice that's needed. It might actually be a member of staff, depending on just what the support need is. And we've internal programmes like maximising community assets, where there's a very quick turnaround. So the community were to come to us and say, well, I've got a specific need for a particular issue, and it's an obstacle to us progressing. We've got the potential to be able to make an investment very quickly and shift the confidence back to the community to say, well, you can do this, and here's the resources with which you can go forward.
So you're spending quite a lot of time and effort in empowering communities who are taking over and running these assets.
Terrific amount of time, and we are extremely pleased to be doing that on the basis that the impact that we recognise and can evidence from community-led initiatives, community-led regeneration, and I think I said when I spoke to this committee previously, I distanced myself from the term bottom-up because there were some references earlier, the gents on the panel previously talking about not being arrogant, not being patronising to communities. I think it's nothing more patronising than talking about bottom-up. The reality is community-led regeneration very often achieves things that perhaps we wouldn't be able to achieve, and categorically in some areas we definitely wouldn't be able to achieve if it weren't for the communities identifying for themselves what they want to do, how they want to go about it, and really taking control of decision-making at a local level. It's phenomenally powerful. So we rightly, I believe, and our leadership team, our board believes, invest in providing intensive support. And we've 8 area teams across the Highlands and Islands. We have a number of other local offices. We have strengthening community staff and heads of strengthening communities within all of those teams. We have over 40 local development officers that are employed by communities within communities that are supported by HIE within the Highlands and Islands area at the moment. These are critical resources, but in the grand scheme of things are not wildly expensive proportionately resources, but the results that they deliver is absolutely phenomenal. To give you a number, because I know the committee likes numbers, in the last couple of years we've been supporting community asset acquisition, but not for its own sake. Community asset acquisition is part of a journey, and it's a means through which communities are then more empowered and more enabled to deliver services, generate income, strengthen the community's balance sheets. And in the last couple of years, which is just the period that I looked at the numbers for, community-owned assets that have transferred in that period have generated £4.4 million worth of turnover in the social economy. And I think facts like that, from a relatively small, couple of dozen assets there, facts like that challenge us to look again at the value judgments that we make about the order and quantum of investment that we put into community-led, but also perhaps to turn on its head the value equation around the value of an asset and what happens when it transfers into the hands of a community. If in real terms what that community is doing then is ploughing that even more money as a result of having that asset in its hands into the community, then surely we need to consider whether or not that can feature in that transactional asset transfer equation.
So you are basically the funders and the facilitators, and this is truly community-led, would you say?
Absolutely, yes. And we are an enabler and a part funder, because we...
Have there been any failures, Ms McCormack, in terms of the projects that you have taken on?
I'm going to respond as a politician and say that's probably depends on how you define failure. I mean, a failure could be a community not getting to a point that it plans to reach within a particular time period.
But there has been nothing that has completely and utterly fallen apart.
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, Sandra's headed up our community assets team for a number of years and been involved in the community assets team for over a decade.
Okay, before I take in Ms McTaggart, one of the things which I'm interested in, obviously a lot of the work that you're doing is very rural. Is there any of these projects in the urban areas within the Highland region?
We currently support about 47 account-managed communities, and they are predominantly mapped over areas where there is greatest social and economic challenge, so fragility and remote rural areas, but not exclusively. And we're currently working with the Highland Council looking at an opportunity to transpose those principles of community account management into more urban areas, so into the likes of Inverness, into Fort William, Thurso, Wick, those sorts of areas within our region. In terms of community asset acquisition, Sandra can probably give some examples of where community assets in perhaps pseudo-urban areas are in control of communities. Perhaps the Borough Hall in Dunoon, which is one of our largest settlements, would be a good example.
Ms Holmes?
Yes. I think it's fair that the majority of the sort of larger landholding assets are in rural areas. There are aspirations in more urban areas, mainly centred around built assets and buildings. There are a number of examples, but the majority of the community-owned asset portfolio is more rural-based. Okay,
final question before I take in Ms McTaggart, and that is, all of this sounds like particularly good practice. It did the last time you were in front of the committee, Ms McCormack. How are we exporting that good practice to other parts of Scotland to ensure that communities are getting the same kind of direction that you are providing in the Highlands, to ensure that communities are empowered and can move on with asset acquisitions themselves, if that, of course, is what they require in their particular area?
Privileged and delighted to be leading on two national programmes for the Scottish Government, one of which is the Scottish Land Fund, which we've talked about. The other is Community Broadband Scotland. And both of those have required us to stretch our wings in terms of the support that we provide to communities beyond the Highlands and Islands areas. So we have staff at the moment, albeit only a handful, but we have staff in the rest of Scotland specifically on those programmes which the government has given us a mandate to undertake. So over and above those, so some of the support and resources and expertise, quite particularly, that we have in the High area is transferring into the rest of Scotland. But probably moreover, perhaps a really good example of how we're sharing that learning is a joint learning event that we ran yesterday together with DTAS, and Ian was there, together with SCDC and colleagues within the Scottish Government, where we looked at, quite in focus, the Scottish Government Strengthening Communities programme, which Higher involved in, with a view to how that programme can act as a catalyst to see how agencies and organisations can come together and better share information, expertise, and, to the extent that we're able, resources to be able to really maximise the impact. Importantly, not just of that programme. I was very keen in speaking to the group of 40 or so staff that amassed yesterday to say this isn't about a £2 million investment, which is in this little pocket over here. This is about how we collaborate across Scotland for the benefit of Scotland's communities. And we're certainly very keen to do that. And I'm very pleased. I was recently invited to discussion with Scottish Borders Council along the lines of, tell us more, what are you doing, how might we emulate it, how might that transfer or map over in terms of the relationship of Scottish Borders geography and the nature of the rural area within the Highlands and Islands. So at every opportunity, Convener, we are taking those steps to share knowledge, but doubtless we can absolutely do more, and we were very, very open to.
Okay, thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I would like to now talk about one of the omissions that has been not spoke about this morning, is our greatest resource in our communities, which is our young people. We spoke earlier at the earlier panel about community councils, community planning partnership, and the structures that involves and how that's created, and how difficult that is, and how representative that is for people in our communities. How do we make our young people want to become involved? I am aware that throughout Glasgow we do have shadow boards for young people and try and encourage young people to come through. But if we can't get the representatives to attend the community councils and the structures that are already there, currently there, how have you been involving the young people, our greatest resource?
Let's start with ACC McCormick, please.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, probably our most current initiative that we have picked up is Scottish Police Youth Volunteers, which we're currently rolling out in Scotland's 4 largest cities, and have an intention to take that forward into the other 10, as we would call them, division areas. And essentially, how that operates is we invite. We form a group of people who would be interested in becoming involved in that, obviously linked to the police, but actually the volunteer leaders come from out with the police, and we discuss and agree an agenda around good citizenship, engagement, contribution, leadership, and are implementing those programmes. That's probably the most active way that we are, as well as, of course, being involved in youth work. Prince's Trust, which I'm sure maybe other colleagues were at here at their event last week, as are we involved in, and promoting engagement with young people that way, promoting engagement through our work with schools and with colleges, again around that good citizenship agenda. They're probably the main things, Commissioner.
Mr. Samuel?
Yeah. You're absolutely right that we know from the evaluation of GCA that one of the problems is finding this succession planning. But as far as young people is concerned, we do actually have one programme. I can't remember exactly where. I can get that detail for you. And they have won awards because they have this shadow board. So they are trying to accommodate the succession that way, that they will have young people coming forward through that shadow board, eventually joining the main board.
Thank you. And from HIE?
In terms of the community asset transfer process and community land ownership, it's probably fair to say that there are a relatively limited number of young people involved in the community organisations that take forward those acquisitions. Notwithstanding, community organisations are always very keen to come to us and say, can we have a summer placement? Can we have a graduate to support what we're trying to do? And we're always very able to secure interest in placements and opportunities for graduates, and that's something that we promote. We promote them in some of our most remote rural areas. We also have a scheme of graduate non-graduate placements, specifically around supporting Gaelic community social enterprise and business enterprises. But I think for the Highlands and Islands region, the challenge of young people choosing to stay in the region, young people participating in activities is an interesting one. And it's certainly, I think it's multifaceted. What we recognise is we've got a series of opportunities around digital, around creative industries, around the attractiveness of the region in terms of things like adventure tourism and adventure activities generally, that are really significant hooks for young people to get involved. One of the projects that we've taken forward through our Ambitious for Culture policy is a pilot phase of a programme that we're hoping to roll out more significantly called Creative Collaborative Communities. And that's support into creative social enterprises, but with a very specific emphasis on that social enterprise and perhaps its theme. It might be dance, might be arts, might be whatever. It might be within its geography, identifying opportunities to involve more young people, both in terms of engaging young people, getting the dynamism and energy that they bring into the organisation, thinking as well about succession planning, thinking about innovation, and making sure that the offer that we have within the region is pertinent and relevant to young people. So digital participation is another area where Community Broadband Scotland, within my directorate, is looking at ways in which young people can be the ambassadors for the digital opportunity that communities have ahead of them. And in some of our most rural areas where that digital opportunity is perhaps not going to be realised in the short term through market. So a community's got to be inspired to want to need the service before it can think about perhaps organising itself to be able to be seeking investment and thinking about planning its service. And what better an ambassador can there be than young people who, I was hearing a story yesterday of a digital connect up actually having a...
Okay, I don't want to go too much into digital. I realise that you've got some exciting things there. The concentration is on young people in this question. Ms McTaggart?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Convener. It was touching on issues around, the issue around failure that was mentioned and what can be done to perhaps augment and support community initiatives when they come forward. And one that springs to mind is one from my own area of a number of sporting groups who came together with a view to taking on essentially the ownership of a patch of land with the view to developing and running a sports facility, a multi-sports facility. It was a very ambitious project, perhaps too ambitious. There were difficulties around access of funding, but one of the key problems that arose was around advice and support for that group of essentially volunteers in order to assist them to make good decisions and good choices around what they did in terms of the approach towards the local authority, in terms of the approach to sourcing funding, in terms of who they got into partnership with. And as a result, the project stalled, didn't move forward, and as far as I'm aware, has now ceased as an active project. How can we ensure that where we have groups who want to come together, who want to take something positive forward, that we can ensure that they get A, good advice, but B, also good support in terms of access to funding, etc., so that barriers are not put in their way, or they feel that they have to maybe look to try and align themselves to private organisations rather than maybe looking at other ways to get hold of funding.
Okay, Mr Samuel?
Yeah, we can provide support ourselves, but it tends to be once people contact us, of course, and we do have an outreach team who go out and promote all these programmes and try and get people to make contact with us. There's lots of support out there before people actually reach us, though. So there's the third sector interface. There's people in the voluntary sector who can help, who will have experience and knowledge of where to go. And local authorities also have external funding officers. We do a lot of contact with them, and they're there to help groups find funding as well and speak through projects. We can also provide, we have a fund called Investing in Ideas, which provides groups with up to £10,000. It's supposed to be quite light touch. And that would allow groups to think about what it is they want to do, work through feasibility studies, go and visit another project somewhere in the country, and to give them a better idea what it is they want to do. So, and then once, of course, they're into our system, as I said, we can provide quite a lot of support as well.
Can I ask Mr Samuel, I think that some of the stumbling blocks that Mr MacDonald rightly identifies is that at very early stages, when folk go to external funding officers and others, the first thing that folks say is, come back with a business plan. Now, for many people in communities, define, first of all, what a business plan is. At this moment in my own constituency, some folk are looking at trying to resurrect the Bon Accord baths. But, business plan. Would you actually provide funding and expertise from the big lottery to help folk along the path of formulating that business plan?
Not at that early stage, convener. I mean, we go through a two-stage process, and the first stage is really to build up this idea, first of all, and to get an idea of what the project's about. So at that stage, there would be, as I say, this investing ideas money up to £10,000 to do that basic stuff. We wouldn't be looking for a business plan from an organisation coming to stage one. Should they clear stage one, then yes, definitely there would be, as I say, support from social investment business to help them with the business planning. But we can always give them development support, as well, development funding, as well, up to £50,000 to do some more of the feasibility studies, to do some more of the technical stuff, and to get some legal advice, whatever, with the idea being that when they come to stage two, it's a much better application we see. So once they're in our system, there's quite a bit of advice and support we can provide, both practical and financially.
Okay, ACC McCormack, please.
I appreciate that this might be more ad hoc than the structured way. I think we probably would all like to see that sort of support for community activity, but I do know that community officers in many areas, particularly if it's a smaller scheme, will become involved in working with a group of young people or a group of older people, whomever, regarding if there are dimensions of the activity which would promote community safety or indeed diversionary activity. I've personally written some successful and some unsuccessful big lottery applications in previous lives, and I know that many of my colleagues have. So in some communities, in that broadest sense, and I know that it might be the youth development worker, etc. So there are networks out there that I think the trick is for those networks to be as skilled up and as accessible rather than necessarily ad hoc as we would all want them to see them.
I think the difficulty for these groups, and it's difficult for us as well, and many of us have quite a lot of experience in this, is to actually get over that first hurdle. And that normally is the business plan scenario. Can I ask Ms McCormack, in terms of the HIE work, do you help folks formulate these business plans so that they can access more funding?
Yes, we do, convener, and probably prior to that, the single most significant investment that we make is a commitment to a community organisation coming to us that they would have a point of contact within our organisation. HIE doesn't have all of the answers. We don't have terrific budgets of the order of big, but what we do have is very experienced, capable staff who can provide advice, expertise, support and signposting. So having that one point of contact is really very important, and that's a point of contact that stays with the community. It's the single most important thing that communities play back to us as being really valuable to them, that account management relationship or that direct relationship with HIE. But over and above that, at an early stage of a community coming together and perhaps looking at wanting to draw together a plan or undertake a community consultation exercise, we provide small amounts of funding that are very, very quick in terms of turnaround for a community to have autonomy, to have to feel empowered and to be able to have some small amount of resource at its disposal that it can go and make some decisions. And that might be at an early stage covering the costs of printing and photocopying and getting flyers out to raise awareness of a community event. They're the sorts of, believe it or not, barriers that community organisations sometimes fail at right at that first hurdle. But we would support feasibility studies, business planning, and those very formative pieces of work as well.
I'm going to take Mark MacDonald, and then I'm going to take Mr Buchanan with a wee supplementary.
Sure. I mean, one of the difficulties that a lot of community groups, organisations face is that there is a cluttered landscape out there in terms of where they can go for advice. Now, there are some people who you can go to for advice and they're very good. there are other people who, frankly, you wouldn't send to get your messages, who are saying that they can give great advice to communities, they can help them along the way. And I think one of the dangers that attaches, if we are going to say more communities will be empowered to do more things, to take on more responsibilities, is that there are some individuals out there who will see that as an opportunity to attach themselves to a community group or organisation and say, I can help you. I can get you this, that and the other, when they've got a track record of not being able to do that, or they're somebody who isn't capable of doing that. So how can we ensure that community groups, organisations are protected in a way from falling into the trap of getting advice from people who, frankly, shouldn't be involved in giving advice to them about these sorts of things?
Can we have brief answers on this? Can we start with ACC McCormick? Some of these folks may have been reported to you in the past.
Yeah, I mean, kind of sitting in the back of my mind quite often is the fraud question. Yeah, I mean, we're not obviously directly in this business, but would clearly, if people do make reference to us about people who are taking the messages, never mind not getting them correctly, would obviously be willing to support. And local officers may have some experience in that, in terms of who they've seen and worked with well in communities, but probably not well placed to provide any sort of formal structure for that or support for it. I wouldn't like to say.
Mr. Samuel, you mentioned third sector interfaces there earlier on.
Yes, I mean, I would think they'd be quite a good source of information. I mean, we're very conscious of this, and when we see stuff coming through from consultants, there's a variable quality, and it's something we're going to look at going forward. We operate something which I've mentioned to this committee before, called a single front door, so that the applicant doesn't have to worry what it is they're applying for. They can just phone up and get advice about whether they fit with our funding or indeed with any other form of funding. So again, that would be a useful resource to make use of. But the quality issue, yes, I agree with you, it is a problem. It's something that we're going to look at going forward.
From HIE's point of view?
With the specific remit that we have directly employed staff with, in some instances, decades of experience and proven track records and relationships with communities where there is trust. And I think it's very difficult to build up trust if the advice that you're giving is poor. It's very difficult to maintain your employment in our organisation if the advice you're giving is poor. Notwithstanding that, we have many other providers around and about Hyde that provide support into community organisations, and we're absolutely rigorous in terms of our selection and procurement of any consultants coming to the table, and certainly would not continue to use particular advisors if we felt that the advice was being given was not robust. But I think really very critically, advice, some of the best advice that our communities get over and above the high advice, I would say that, is advice that communities give to one another. So where have they gotten good advice, good support, good service from? So we bring together on a very regular basis groups of communities around particular areas of interest. That might be around digital, it might be around renewable energy, it might be around asset acquisition, it might be around general community activities and growth planning within communities, so they can talk to one another and share expertise and share good contacts. That networking is really key.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you. I just want to come in on business plans. In my experience, business plans are often very aspirational and mostly financial, but nobody can really quantify them. I was quite interested in the £10,000 you said you give to people. Does that include not having necessarily a business plan? I mean, can you get your advice and the money before you actually write a plan? Because a lot of these plans, I won't say are not worth the paper they're written on, but it's my colleague there said, Mark said that you wouldn't trust people to take the messages in a way, because they all want to come in on these business plans because they think it's a way of making money. But these business plans don't often work and are not really thought through very carefully. What is your experience on that?
Mr. Samuel.
We wouldn't require a business plan. The £10,000 is there to do things like feasibility studies, community consultation, because through GCA, one of the things we want to ensure is that the project has the community behind it. So community consultation is very important to us. We would, however, require a business plan at stage 2 when they come into stage 2 of the process, but that's where the support from social investment business kicks in. So they will work with the group to develop their own business plan. So it should be more robust in terms of what that group is trying to do and where they hope to be in 4 or 5 years' time. We do realise, of course, that things change. And I think Big Lottery Fund is known for being flexible with applicants, but particularly grant holders. Once they actually get their money, we appreciate that, you know, particularly as was mentioned in the previous evidence session, you know, we've gone through the biggest recession in living memory, you know, and so we do appreciate that things change, and we have to be flexible as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. MacDonald.
Just following on the question around business plans as well, is the question around expectation management for communities. And the example which I referenced earlier, I think, was one where expectation management was allowed to get a little bit out of control and more was bitten off than could be chewed. At what stage do your organisations or those in your organisations who are involved with community groups or organisations who are looking to develop something take a step and say, well, look, you're maybe going a bit too fast on this, and maybe what you need to do is do this on an incremental basis? Is that the kind, you know, is that kind of advice offered, or is it a simple, we can't fund this because it's too big, or do you try and give that kind of advice that maybe they should take it in a staged process?
We cannot legislate for common sense, of course, but in terms of the draft bill, is there any way that we could, maybe behind the bill and guidance, give good tips in terms of actually ensuring that good practice goes along? Because I think one of the frustrating things, as Mr MacDonald really points out, is where a community thinks that they're well on the way when the reality is they haven't gone very far, and a project can sometimes be doomed to failure at the very beginning, but nobody has the guts to actually tell them that.
As far as Big Lottery Fund and GCA is concerned, we've upped the stage 1 process. Sandra was involved in the early stages of GCA 1, as we talk about, and I think we realised we were being too generous with letting a lot of projects through at stage 1, who spent a lot of time then developing very complicated stage 2 applications. They got to committee and they were refused, and that just wasn't acceptable. It wasn't acceptable for the applicants, and it certainly wasn't acceptable for our staff who had to spend time assessing these. So we've really raised the bar as far as stage 1 is concerned, and we're a lot more honest with groups now. If it isn't looking like a goer, then we tell them that at stage 1, so that they're not wasting their time and we're not wasting our time. But we will provide support. So, you know, this is why we don't think this is worthwhile. Maybe you should go away and get an Invest in Ideas award to do the consultation, to do some more of that, or indeed seek some support. Yeah.
That was the supplementary I was going to ask, was do you just say no at stage 1, or do you say no, but if you come back with something a little bit more modest, we might be able to look at it?
Absolutely. And I think you go away with the impression that a lot of these groups are, you know, being over-enthusiastic. Some of them actually think we've got a better chance of getting money if we actually keep it back, keep it down. And in some cases, we actually do say, no, that's not realistic, you actually need more money. And we will increase, or ask them to increase what it is they're applying for.
Okay, thank you. Stuart McMillan, please.
First question is to Ms McCormack. Just a few moments ago, you mentioned, well, you spoke about the remit of High, and do you think that that your remit, which obviously is different from that of Scottish Enterprise, do you think that your remit actually helps and facilitates the role that you do, particularly within the rural communities?
Ms McCormack.
Thank you. Of course, yes, it does, and that combination of our social development and economic development remit for High is extremely powerful. It's very liberating. I gave a presentation to my group recently and talked about the Act that established High in the 90s, and basically that says we can do stuff that's good in the Highlands and Highlands as long as it works for the Highlands and Highlands. And you know, that's extremely that was extremely bold legislation of its time, and really does give us the autonomy to be able to support the social impacts that we're looking for, economic impacts, and wherever possible, an absolute integration of the two.
Thank you.
Mr. McMillan.
Thank you for that answer. And the second question is just it's to all of the panellists. One of the final comments that we heard from the previous panel was on the issue of community planning, and that the individual did state that they realised that it probably wouldn't be removed from the draft bill or a bill coming forward. But they felt as if that removing community planning actually would be a useful thing. And I'm just keen to gauge the opinion of the panellists as to whether you think that that actually would be a good thing, or do you think community planning has actually improved community planning actually has a role to play with community empowerment?
Let's move to ACC McCormick first, please.
Yeah, thank you. This is probably the area in the bill that I and my service feel particularly strongly about. The question, and I think probably in fairness to the previous question, is more a question about whether it belongs in this bill rather than it belongs as a question, and I think you picked that up, Mr McMillan. But for me, I do think there is real scope and potential in community planning. It almost feels, that sort of like godlike thing. If it wasn't there, we'd need to invent it kind of idea. I really do think that there are massive opportunities in community planning. There are tensions for the organisations participating about our obligations to our own boards, authorities, that can at times conflict with what's the requirement of the mutual effort of the partnership coming together. So it is a very tense situation, or a potentially difficult situation, but I think it's one that we absolutely need to work through, because I do think that's the real way at some local level, and I appreciate from many of the comments we've heard this morning it's about even more local levels and more, even more front-facing and involvement in that. But I think if we can get ourselves to a point where we do oblige, as suggested in the bill, people to participate, that we oblige people to be preparing a single outcome agreement, have some obligation on those or agencies to deliver on their part as agreed through the process to meet those single outcome agreements. And my experience of CPPs and SOAs is that there is a strong underpinning consultation around that, around the priority setting. Not as strong as we would ever perhaps all wish it to be, but it's definitely in the right way. So whether it's this bill or elsewhere, I would urge the committee to think about pushing through on many of the measures that are in there, recognising that there needs to be some flexibility to allow those organisations to discharge their respective obligations to their own boards, but nevertheless obligate them to come together and deliver on outcomes for communities through consultation identified.
Mr Samuel, do you have any comments on that?
No. Very brief. This is the area of the draft bill that we did not pass many comments on.
I thought that would be the case, sir. And HIE reps, do you have anything that you'd like to say at this point?
In terms of its inclusion within the community empowerment draft bill as it stands at the moment, the one thing we would advocate quite strongly is the balance between the things that we do need to legislate for and the things that we can actually increase the momentum through powerful partnership, which is out there in some places, and encourage and enable community planning partnerships to do of their own accord. There's a question, I suppose, around what we include in legislation, whether that becomes the baseline and the absolute, and whether that removes the potential for community planning partnerships to be thinking creatively and innovatively and above that baseline. So we would advocate a balance.
Thank you. Okay, John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just want to go back to a point that was raised earlier by Ms Holmes and Ms McCormick, and it was regarding the example of the piece of forestry land that was transferred over to community. And Ms Holmes, I think you actually mentioned significant private investment in that project. Could you give any examples of where you feel the private sector or the investment, private finance in projects have been beneficial? Because many of the community asset transfers we may be talking about are in urban areas and deprived communities, and the inclusion of private finance may actually worry some funders as well as some communities.
Ms Holmes.
The example given, the inclusion of the private financing, came very much from the community group themselves. They were looking at purchasing an asset with a net worth of 1.5 million, give or take. And clearly that would be a big ask of any public funder, irrespective of where the monies are coming from. So they took a very pragmatic look and were very keen to realise their objectives. And they, in doing their business planning, they recognised that some of the asset, they could forward sell some of the timber to a private operator. They retain the solum, so they own and control the overall asset, but the timber on part of it was being forward sold to generate the capital receipt to go towards the overall purchase. So it was on their terms, and it was enabling them to take forward a large land asset acquisition, still delivering very powerful outcomes for the community group.
As I said, I just wanted to examine that because it's interesting that they're forward selling timber to actually draw down some funding to fund for that. And I'm assuming the land was transferred for the Forestry Commission and not a private owner.
Yes, it's from the Forestry Commission at market value.
The next question, Convener, is a complete quantum leap from that question, is to ask the panel about the legal structures that would be advisable for communities who want to take on community asset transfers, because we have a number of different structures that are now being proposed. Now we've got companies limited by guarantee, we've got the basic committee, we've now got SCIOs, and we've got level 1 SCIOs, level 2 SCIOs. So what would be the best advice to any community organisation who wish to engage in the community asset transfer and future management of that transfer? What would be the best structure for those communities?
Ms McCormack, do you want to go first?
I think it very much depends on the intentions of the community organisation and what they're looking to do. In our response to the consultation on the draft bill, we suggested that the characteristics of the community organisation are things that we focus on, as opposed to saying this type of governance structure or that one, recognising that there's something to be said for longevity in legislation if we're prescriptive and identify particular entities that are appropriate or not for community asset transfer, then there's a chance that a new one might come along and the legislation would need to be amended to be able to accommodate it. So the key characteristics are what we've focused on rather than the entity itself.
Okay, Mr Samuel.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It very much depends what the project's aiming to do. We're much more concerned, as I say, that the project has the backing of the community and can display that. Historically, we found most of them are companies limited by guarantee, but there is more interest being shown in SCIOs nowadays as well.
I think KCC McCormack, you can give this one a miss, yeah? Okay. I want to change the subject slightly in terms of community asset transfer, and we've talked a lot about buildings and things today. Allotments featured last week. The Allotments Act leaves a lot to be desired in terms of those kind of asset transfers. Have Big Lottery had experience of that? And what advice would you give in terms of the formulation of the draft bill and trying to improve what I think is the 1892 Allotments Act?
I think we did submit some evidence, Chair. Allotments haven't featured under growing community assets, I've got to say, because the idea behind growing community assets, as Rachel talked about as well, is that the project is sustainable, and we haven't found growing projects to be sustainable. So there haven't been, I can recall, sort of growing projects coming in to take ownership.
Okay. We
have another programme called Community Spaces Scotland, which isn't about ownership, but it can be leasing, and there's been some more growing projects have come through there. So don't really have any advice to give on ownership.
Thank you. And finally, also we've had discussion around about common good, and often there's been difficulty in terms of asset registers. I don't know if either HIE or the Big Lottery have had difficulties in terms of some of these aspects, and if so, do you have any advice in terms of what's contained in the draft bill? Mr Samuel?
Yeah, as we said, we think a register would be a good idea, but we think that registers across the board, as far as local authorities are concerned, would be a good idea, because we've had a project. It took them years to conclude because it turned out the local authority didn't actually know, or found out that they didn't own the asset they were transferring. So if these things can be resolved sooner rather than later, it certainly helps the projects that come to us for money.
Okay, Ms McCormack, have you had any experience in HIE with common good assets?
To be honest, it's an issue that's perhaps more prevalent in the rest of Scotland than it is in the Highlands and Islands. We do come into contact with projects around common good from time to time, but essentially our aspirations in terms of the bill would be around increased transparency, communities having the position at the table to be able to participate in decisions around common goods going forward, and that online register type approach that Eric's referred to, really key.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I thank you for your evidence today? I suspend and we'll move into private session. Thank you. Do you want to start again, folks, at 10 past? Because folk are needing the loo.